Pretty much no one is happy with the fashion industry right now.
Fast fashion.
Ultra fast fashion.
It made fast fashion.
Those
even
consumers
faster.
are looking for the best bang for their
Make
buck.
as much profit as possible.
People who buy luxury are unhappy with the quality. The people who buy fast fashion are unhappy with the quality. The environmental impact is horrific, and the labor practices are not much better. Where do you go from here? In Paris, there is a New Zealand-born designer named Oliver Church who personally makes every single piece of clothing he sells. His process starts with sourcing vintage or even antique textiles, and then he cuts, sews, and dyes everything himself in an atelier on the outskirts of Paris. In an article on Church, Haisna Baidi quotes him, saying, "All the processes that make clothes are ultimately very human. This is a contrast to what much of the wider industry is doing." Oliver Church's brand has been around since 2020. He only makes about 150 to 200 pieces a year, and each one goes for about $1,000 to $3,000, but he has made a sustainable business out of this. Oliver Church and other clothing brands like his are very popular in a specific if you know niche of menswear. This cohort is dreaming of a slower and more intentional way of making clothing. I would call a lot of these brands 10-year overnight successes. This happens in any industry, right? Someone is working on their craft, they're toiling away at their career, and then 10 years in, they suddenly hit the mainstream. They become very popular, and everyone's like, where did they come from? It makes sense that these brands are hyper-relevant in an era where everyone is sick of plastic clothing. Whether or not it makes total sense, people are moving away from polyester and towards natural materials. And they want natural dyes. Well, these are the brands that are providing that. The most hyped names in this scene have to be US-based Evan Knorri, Japan-based Coddle, and Australia-based Mantle. I did say this was menswear, though a lot of these brands either don't specify, or they say it's unisex, or they sell both. But in my experience, most of the people who are paying attention to this niche and buying the clothing are men. I, of course, buy everything, and you can too. To be clear, I have made up this arbitrary grouping of brands, but I do think there are some key similarities that they share. I would say the hallmarks are an extremely textile-first way of designing, transparency around sourcing and manufacturing, so who is making the textiles and where, and small batch production, so they're not making that much clothing. Some of these brands make it hard to buy their clothing at all. Either it's made to order, you have to go online, send an order in, and then you'll be waiting 4 weeks, 6 weeks, a couple months to get your clothing, or they only sell it in person. They have like such a minimal website, maybe just an Instagram, and you have to find it in store. But with all this, we have a sort of answer to the fashion industry anxiety we've had since the 2000s, when fast fashion and supply chain globalization became mainstream. So this specific artisanal menswear type of brand seems like a response to the state of the fashion industry. But is it a solution? I do think it's super interesting that a fairly distinguishable corner of the scene has emerged like this, but I'm not convinced that it's the cure-all we've been looking for. Of course, I am not the only person interested in this phenomenon. My friend Ashley has been thinking about it as well.
I just see like menswear shifting more towards like so-called artisanal fashion anyway. And so I was thinking I wanted to explore where we're kind of at with it and what does it even mean anymore?
This is Ashley Ogawa-Clark. He is a British fashion journalist based in Tokyo. He writes for Vogue and other publications about Japanese fashion and menswear in general. He was hip to this scene much earlier than me. In September 2025, he wrote an article called "Why Cool Guys Are Wearing Such Understated Clothes and How to Get the Look" for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote, "Stylish, clued-in men are embracing breezily elegant items that seem unremarkable at first glance, but have a little something extra. Rumpled linen that drapes artfully, say, or an alluring shade of faded chocolate. The prevailing look is logoless, comfortable, relaxed tailoring." I do think the popularity around this type of clothing is linked to the general trend, where brands are really trying to emphasize the craft or craftsmanship that goes into their products, during this period where the luxury sector is in its biggest slump since 2008.
And then the other thing is the luxury industry in general. I think there's a lot less trust in it than there was. So do you see like Wisdom K like pulling his like gold buttons off his Miu Miu?
The people at Miu Miu have sent me replacement items for the 2 items that broke as soon as I got home. The jacket.
Like moment, I suppose, on social media where you realize that, or a lot of people were talking about, is big luxury is it actually luxurious? And what does luxury even mean?
It's really not a good look for them because prices for these luxury products have been going up and up and up, while consumer trust and their quality has been going down. A great article about this shift is "How Craft Became Luxury's Most Valuable Currency" for Vogue Business by Madeline Schultz. Schultz writes, "It's an opportune moment for brands to up the ante on their storytelling about craftsmanship. Consumers are more discerning and more fatigued than they have been in a long time, jaded by what they view as unjustified price hikes and ambivalence, or even suspicion about luxury quality. Couple that with social media-induced ad fatigue, made worse by an onslaught of algorithmically fed AI-made content, and luxury has some convincing to do. And I find this to be true for fast fashion as well right now. Zara is desperately trying to distance itself from its reputation for making poor clothing and cheap materials. For their 2025 Halloween photo shoot, they hired Sylvester Mako, who I think of as a more editorial or high fashion photographer. And they've also been collaborating with Erin Levine, a real menswear sweetheart. Though they may not have any transparency around how much clothing they produce or how, they are ready, willing, and able to embrace the aesthetics of craft. In February of 2025, there was some relatively minor drama that the fashion substack Blackbird Spyplane covered. One of the biggest players in this artisanal menswear scene, designer Evan Kenori himself, texted the writers a picture of Zara's men's suiting page, where they had seemingly recreated Kenori's exact showroom setup. Then apparently by that evening, Zara removed the image from their site. My main takeaway is that Zara is paying attention to this niche. They see the appeal and they think that they can use it. H&M have been up to similar hijinks, like when they were selling fake selvage denim jeans, or when they came up with something called H&M Atelier, which is described on their site as introducing a new perspective on men's fashion, a seamless journey through craftsmanship, masculinity, and style. In some ways, this could be considered a win. Artisanal menswear brands are providing a roadmap for fast fashion to up their game. Though, of course, Zara and H&M's relatively shallow embrace of the core tenets show that they're more interested in it as a branding exercise. They're not going to rehaul their manufacturing process. In the luxury sector, messaging around quality and craftsmanship has been relatively successful, especially during the Great Fashion Reset, where designer brands are trying to resuscitate consumer demand for their offerings.
At Chanel, it's very much about like fabrication on a really granular level. I think about showing us like new ways of making fabrics and new ways of making beauty through fabric. That's what feels like is important to us at the moment.
Chanel is, of course, one of the oldest couture houses around, and many people would equate couture with the highest form of craftsmanship. Chanel also puts out something called the Métiers d'Art collections. Their website reads, every year since 2002, they celebrate the exceptional French savoir-faire at the heart of the house's creations. If you scroll through, the page highlights embroiderers, goldsmiths, milliners, tweed makers, and more. Chanel's 2026 Métiers d'Art collection was shown in the New York City subway and was very well regarded. People have also been really liking Mathieu Blazy's ready-to-wear collections. He's Chanel's new creative director. When his first collections were released in March of 2026, customers were storming the stores in a way that we haven't seen for years. Editor and luxury customer Brian Boy described the scene in an article Vogue called Inside the Chanel Frenzy in Paris. I've never seen such frenzy and fracas when all the editors are shopping, since Alessandro Michele's debut collection for Gucci a decade ago. One of the biggest sellers was this button-up that they made in collaboration with Charvet, a very well-known high-end Parisian shirt maker. It is a fairly simple cotton shirt with a little Chanel embroidered on the side. That same article says, it costs 3,900 euros and is sold out. Ask for the version with the plastron or the pink one, and the laughter of a sales associate is the most eloquent answer you will receive. Now, this is, of course, the thing about luxury houses. They do have this very specialized, artisanally made couture work, but there are levels to this. Luxury ready-to-wear is generally not made in ateliers, it's made in factories. Which is not to say that it's inherently bad or even middling quality. Most clothing is made in factories. But ultimately, the high-end artisanal work that you see on the Chanel runway is more about signaling brand quality rather than a promise for what the general consumer will actually have access to. Luxury brands are not super transparent around their production facilities or where they source their materials. So in absence of that, signaling quality and craft has a lot to do with brand marketing and storytelling. I do think Chanel is being very smart about their current direction, especially partnering with a brand like Charvet. They are a very well-regarded shirt-making company and actually a good comp for the niche we're talking about today. Their popularity has been rising, their website barely exists, and they do their business based off of a mixture of ready-to-wear and made-to-measure. Anyway, Charvet has resisted acquisition. They're not owned by anyone, they're independent, and they have not scaled exponentially. You can find their ready-to-wear shirts at retailers like Bergdorf Goodman, Mr. Porter, Saks Fifth Avenue, and they go for about $500 to $1,000. But the shirts they made with Chanel, remember, go for $4,000, or they would if you could find any that were available. Now, let's compare that to Caudle, which is a brand I've talked about before. I've interviewed the designer Toshi-san. You can watch more of that in a previous video, which I will link somewhere. They develop their own fabrics in Kojima, Japan, which is an area known for denim production. The fabric development process itself can take multiple years. Then everything is made to order and produced in an atelier where about 8 people work. Every single piece of clothing is made from start to finish by one person, which is rare, and we'll talk about that later. Their prices go from about $1,500 for a shirt to about $3,000 for a jacket or coat, both of which are cheaper options compared to the Chanel Charvet collab. One of Chanel's famous tweed jackets from the recent Matthew Blasi collection goes for about $10K, and the prices for a coat are made available upon request.
It's not as if these small-scale independent brands have invented the wheel of working in an artisanal or craft-based way. It's like all these major couture houses have been doing that for almost sometimes over a century. It's just that they are doing it in a very different way.
This is Lucas. I know him from his Substack, Present Forever.
My name is Lucas Malve, and I'm a Dutch-based fashion writer or clothing writer. I like to use that expression, actually. I have a PhD in philosophy, and about 2 or 3 years ago, I switched from working in academia to writing about fashion.
So yes, couture houses have a long history of working with artisans, but I do think that they are still mostly preoccupied with selling a fantasy. Artisanal menswear brands, I think, are still selling a fantasy. It's just a slightly different one.
People, I think, want things to be real, to have a sense of reality in the things that they surround themselves with or that they interact with. And I think, this type of clothing that we're discussing now has that strong sense of reality.
Lucas is tapping into something that one of my favorite online fashion theorists has also been talking about, Ryan Finn, which is the end of phone clothes.
This is evidence. We are moving into the material, what the clothes are made of, what they're constructed out of.
I think this whole movement is motivated in part by our general exhaustion, which started with isolation during the pandemic when we were working from home and we were on our damn phones all the time. We buy and see people buy so much clothing online that we have become fatigued by the unending availability of it. So now we have this analog movement. People are bricking their phones, they're buying MP3 players, they crave something that has a bigger impact in person than on a screen. Ashley describes Evan Kenori's clothing this way.
It's the kind of pants that you sit in the pub for an hour and people are like, oh, that's actually, that fabric's really nice, or these details that you only notice after a while.
The hype around artisanal menswear fits perfectly into this moment.
I think what we're seeing now, and something that I also feel very much driven by, is to, the question how can you engage with fashion? How can you write about fashion in a way that is not determined by visuals, that is not determined by how it looks on a page or on a screen or on a billboard or wherever.
Lucas's answer has been fairly simple. He will not write about clothing that he has only seen pictures of online.
It's like a commitment you have to make to say, okay, I only want to write about a piece of clothing that I've actually seen in real life, touched with my own hands and wore on my own body.
I do love this ethos, and I have made a video about how important I think it is to buy your clothing in person, but this idea will always run headlong into its first problem, which is accessibility. On one hand, yes, I love these brands. The radical transparency, the democratization of clothing made out of artisanal textiles by craftsmen outside of capital F fashion, it's wonderful. But on the other hand, we have to be honest about how accessible this stuff is. It is not and can't be for everyone, the most obvious barrier being price. Part of the reason the luxury sector has been struggling is due to the loss of the aspirational shopper, right? We are in fashion's Gilded Age. Most of the wealth in this country and many others is held in the hands of relatively few people. We have a shrinking middle class, so you have less customers who are willing to save and then spend on a special clothing or accessory purchase. But you also have a lot of people who want to spend time, money, and energy curating their personal style, and if possible, they want to do it outside of the exploitative, destructive, quick churn, mainstream fashion ecosystem. So you have people like me who buy a lot of their stuff secondhand. That works very well. You also have people who get crafty. They learn to knit or crochet or sew. They make their own clothes. But you also have a lot of people who just want to buy something. Of course, there are some people who are not considering the good of society when they make their clothing purchases. And there are some people that buy this type of clothing because they like the inaccessibility. They like that things are one of one, that they're special, they're unique, you're the only person that will have it. And I still think that the feel-good aspect, that it's not made in a sweatshop, still communicates luxury and it still communicates class. You're saying with my buying power, with my purchase power, I don't have to buy something that's made in a sweatshop. I would never degrade myself that way. I would never put something on my body that is synthetic. It's like good. It's good for the environment. It's good for society, but it's also a way to opt out and to say I'm better than people who don't have that option. Before we move on, I want to point out that this video is not sponsored. It did take me a long time to make, and I want to thank my patrons for supporting me so I'm able to make these sorts of long-form, interview-heavy videos. So there are 3 tiers. The first one is the Discord, the second is special video content, and the third is honestly just if you want to throw me some money and you have the ability to. I really, truly appreciate it. Thank you again. Now let's keep going. I have spoken to the people that make this type of artisanal clothing. Toshi-san from Coddle, Bill from William Frederick, and Alejandro from Graziano and Gutierrez. And they are thinking explicitly about the many faults of the fashion industry and how to build a brand that meets their standards of quality, creativity, and morality. Now add on making it a viable business and accessible to the most people possible. Obviously, it's easier said than done.
The reason I went into the fashion industry is because of the overconsumption that I saw and just wanting to be a lot more like methodical and like giving things just like the value that they deserve and making sure that like I'm not making just mass production of things.
This is Alejandro Gutierrez, owner and co-founder of Graziano and Gutierrez. I first met him in Paris during Men's Fashion Week, but Alejandro makes all the clothing himself in a workshop in Portland, but uses Mexican textiles from Chiapas and Oaxaca. Alejandro is from the capital city of Yucatan, but went to school in the States.
I spent a whole semester in the Yucatan working with indigenous communities and working with artisans and kind of like learning just their processes and learning, kind of like all the different textiles. And that's when I sourced and I met the families that we still work with today.
I wanted to talk to him to get a realistic look at what running one of these businesses is like.
It's a fun conversation because even with you're talking about somebody like Kinori and that way you're like, there is so much thought going into the processes and the textiles and the development, yet when you look maybe at like the people that are buying it, maybe some people that buy it do care about those processes, but like some people just happen to have the money and they just like the aesthetic and the world built around the brand, and that's why they buy it. And it just also happens to be like extremely high quality and like super kind of like transparent about their processes. But like, yeah, it's really expensive too.
He knows better than anyone the contradictions that exist within this artisanal menswear scene.
I have plenty of my friends that like love small brands and like they're super aware about like the current like landscape or like politically and kind of like economically, and they're like, oh, I would love to support, but like it will take a couple paychecks for me to do that, and I'm like, so it's it's like a tug of war between like the clientele that I want to be able to afford my clothes, but then the ones that can actually afford it.
Alejandro began selling his shirts for $180, and they now sell for $500. As he says, he didn't go to business school, so he really learned as he went along.
And I feel like as our prices started to have to go up to like match what they actually should be, so I'm not, losing money and living like borderline poverty.
It really took him years to accept how much he needed to charge, and he learned along the way, but he does what he has to keep his business afloat. One of his qualms about the pricing system is the reliance on boutique retailers like Mr. Porter or Essence. Because let's say the material Alejandro needs to make a shirt costs $120, and it takes Alejandro 4 hours to make it. If he pays himself $25 per hour, the shirt costs $220 to make. Then to account for all the other costs that go into running a business, most people multiply that price by, let's say, 2.2, which gets you a shirt that costs $484. But Alejandro needs to sell his shirt to a boutique because his website doesn't get enough traffic. He doesn't have a brick and mortar store. He doesn't have a marketing team or salespeople or customer service. So he sells his $400 to $500 shirt to a boutique who then add on the cost of their business, rent and all their employees and etc. So the shirt winds up being about $800. As a gut check, Alejandro wanted to look at other shirts in this niche to see what they were going for because he didn't even feel comfortable paying himself $25 an hour. He checked out this store called Neighbor in Vancouver.
So Mantle has their mud-dyed button-up shirts that are similar to mine for $850. And I was like, okay, like I think mine are the same quality and they're also like naturally dyed and have a huge amount of storytelling, they should sell for the same price.
He did point to 18 East as an outlier in this system. They sell most of their stuff direct to consumer, and their prices are much lower, though there isn't, I would say, as much transparency on their site about where they get their textiles and how the clothing is made, etc. Though they do say most of it happens in India. I would say the aesthetics and crunchiness places them within this niche, but the price point undercuts a lot of their competition.
Their prices are pretty fair. They're like in the 200s, 300s. And they work with like all these different weavers from India, and like their stuff is like really beautiful and like really, really well, like such an attention to detail. Like I really like it. I think they had like an investment firm come in at some point in like 2021 or 2022 that helped them out, but that's kind of the only way to like grow, like if you have like an investment firm that believes in what you're doing and like sort of like investment and is willing to like help you build that marketing and that customer base, then you should definitely take it. But then at that point you have to question the ethos of the brand and like make sure that you can keep things the way they are and stuff like that.
There is a whole subset of this scene that is doing the look for less. You have places like Gander, which are based out of Manchester in the UK. Gander does source some textiles from Japan, but they do their production in China, and they do sell to boutiques. Obviously, one of the answers to Alejandro's anxiety around pricing is to outsource production, to not make it himself. Of course, here you run into another classic tension. Alejandro doesn't make that much clothing in a year, and factories have minimum order requirements because they go through all this work to like set up a production line to make a certain piece of clothing. They don't only want to make 5 or 10 shirts. Small minimums usually are around 50 pieces, and bigger factories, usually it'll be like in the thousands. And in Alejandro's fight against overproduction, he doesn't want to make more clothing than he knows he can sell.
Like for example, for fall winter, we had this pair of like black trousers, and we got like in total 39 units. It was like 11 short of the 50 minimum, where I could just pay for those 11 and like bring them to the studio and sell them on my website. But it's like an investment that I don't know if I want to like pay that, because then what if those sizes don't sell on my website and then you're sitting there for like months on end and I have to do a sale. And like for me, I love like being intentional about what you do, and that's kind of what we're chasing always. Right now I'm finishing a wholesale order for Standard and Strange, and it's just like quote after quote of like finishing certain garments, and it can just be like a bit taxing on the body and like the mind a little bit more than anything on like my body. Like I have like back pain and stuff like that, and I have to work out in the morning before coming in to like help my back and like do stretching every night. And it's like a love-hate relationship with sewing sometimes.
Remember, the vast majority of our clothing is made in factories. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, and it would help lower prices.
I think for me, it got to a point where I was like, why am I depriving myself of using the factories? Like everybody is, and you can find ways to still stay true to your brand and to like your values without making any compromises. Like a compromise definitely would be, like instead of finding like a factory in New York or in LA, I could be just trying to find a factory in like India or China, or like Vietnam and whatnot. Like I'm not to say that all the factories out there are terrible, not bad quality, but have like low payment for like their workers or like unsafe environment. I'm sure there is plenty that do, but I also put a lot of value in manufacturing in America, and keeping things as close to home as possible. And so that would be like a compromise would be like, being like, oh, let me just find like the factory that makes things the cheapest or something like that.
However, in the same way that using a factory in China does not necessarily equate to bad pay or bad quality, a brand that works with artisans doesn't necessarily mean they are the height of moral purity.
It happens in Mexico a lot. Like something really interesting in Mexico when I spent time down there was that like you will have like European or like American designers coming down, finding like indigenous artisan that knows how to do natural dyes of hand weave or weaving, and they'll make him sign like a contract that they cannot work with anybody else, and they can only work with them. And like even just like the way some of these people will speak, like I remember visiting, when I say names, of visiting somebody's like atelier in the Yucatan, and like they've been like, oh yeah, these are my artisans and whatnot, and I was like, no, these are people.
Alejandro sees communities all the time struggling to get enough orders to maintain their weaving practices or offer certain dyed fabrics. He would argue that the uniqueness of one brand's offering is not worth restricting the amount of business that artisans can generate. He's also pushed back on the culture of haggling, where people go to these indigenous Mexican communities and try to get the textiles for the cheapest price possible.
We do like our best to like pay whatever, like, pay fair wages, like pay for like the textiles like as high as we can. And like there's been plenty of times when they're like, oh, we want to be paid like 15 a meter, and I'm like, okay, I can give you at least like 25 a meter or something like that.
The ideal for Alejandro right now is to move some of the production to a factory so he can focus on growing and developing the brand. But that is not necessarily the pipe dream.
My idea in the dream is to be able to just have like a production studio where like we make all of our samples in-house, like we do all of our manufacturing for the website, kind of like Carol, because like I think they do everything in-house, and it's kind of like I would love to build a structure and a business that is like that. Like I will definitely use factories for stuff that we cannot accomplish ourselves, for like more intricate garments, or maybe for like fully lined zip-up jackets and things like that, or like insulated jackets that like I would love to get into, but it's just completely it's not within my bandwidth today. But ideally, it's looking at the landscape and like how things are. I'm like, the more production I can keep in house and keep control and like be able to like keep more of the profits and not have to be like forking out, because I don't want to take on like loans for like an investor. So like in my head it's always like, how can this be the most organic growth possible that is still sustainable, but I'm also like making enough to like sustain the business and sustain myself.
With these types of brands, like we talked about earlier, some of the decision making about how to actually make the clothing has to do with quality and craftsmanship, and some of it has to do with storytelling. It is a marketing tool to be able to tell your customer that the clothing is handmade by the designer in his atelier, but it also may matter less than we think, especially when the consideration often comes down to price.
The most important thing for me was the buyers, and they were like, no, we really wouldn't care if like a factory makes it or you make it. It's like, they care about the storytelling, the textile, that things are high quality, and that things are just beautiful.
I was actually a little specifically skeptical about how much of a difference it makes when a piece of clothing is made by one person, like Alejandro, versus a couple of people on a production line. So I got a second opinion.
I would pay more for that.
Oh, you will?
For what I would pay more for when it's made by one person as opposed to when it's made by 10 people.
It's always good to talk to an expert.
My name is Naika Kolas. I'm assistant professor of fashion design at Parsons School of Design and also the associate director for the MPS Fashion Management Program. So the research that I'm doing at Parsons, and I've received a few grants, is for a nonprofit initiative that I'm working on. And I'm working with garment workers who have about 20, 30 years experience. They're immigrants, they're refugees and asylum seekers here in New York City.
One of the truisms of the clothing industry is that all clothing is handmade. If you see a brand advertising their clothing as handmade, it's sort of a nonsense claim. We don't really have fully automated clothing making machines. Most of this is manual. Sure, it's with a sewing machine, but clothing manufacturing is really hard to automate. Most clothing these days is manufactured by many people across many countries. It takes a lot of people to make a pair of jeans, starting with who has to grow the cotton, to making the denim, to who is, adding the trims and notions. And in a factory, each task is done by a different person. Someone hems the jeans, someone adds the zipper, someone sews on the tag. Those are garment workers, and as opposed to artisans or craftspeople, a lot of garment workers don't actually know how to make a single piece of clothing from start to finish. This is a tragic form of de-skilling.
When the garment workers, I work with them, they do their sewing trials, they'll say, I don't know how to do this. Oh no, I can't sew this. And then I can't find you this job, because they're looking for someone that knows how to, they're a small brand. Small brands usually, they cannot afford the 10 people. This one person's making it.
But hopefully with more small, independent production facilities, you have more people with marketable skills who can charge more for their work. And you have customers who receive items made with care and intention.
There's so many differences in sewing. So then you'll say, this looks great up until here. Who did this? And you can tell the difference. And so I think I would rather this one person work on this entire garment, because I know it's going to be fully aligned with their goal. Because not everyone has the same goal either when they're working, especially artisans. That work is so They're so creative, but
So you
it's
think
so
it's worth the what do you say? The juice is worth the squeeze.
yeah.
There's a lot of romance here coupled with the cold, hard reality of running a business. You want to pay your artisans well, you want to keep production in-house, you don't want to make too much of any one product, and all of this is in direct opposition to, turning a profit. The fact that these businesses are trying to keep their operations small at all really bucks mainstream fashion norms. I am not an economist, but my understanding is that capitalism requires growth and exponential growth, and that's what a lot of businesses see as the goal.
Yeah, I mean, most big companies want to make money as easily as possible, and if they have to put a huge amount of effort in for very little return, then they're not really incentivized.
This is Roger Treasury. He is a MA Fashion Communications course leader at Central St. Martin's.
I'm in charge of the journalists, fashion journalism. We also have fashion image, which is photographers, image makers, stylists. And we have fashion histories and theories, which is more for people with an academic focus on fashion.
He is plugged into what the kids are learning these days. Naika is too, for that matter. And they have told me that the fashion schools have responded to our concerns about the industry, right? They have been teaching sustainability for 10 years now, and the students are adapting. A lot of fashion students are questioning the traditional trajectory, graduating, working your way up to working at a big luxury house. And Central St. Martin's has traditionally produced a lot of big luxury designers. The thing is, creating and running your own fashion brand is, for all intents and purposes, a delusional idea. I've seen some statistics say that 98% of new clothing brands fail. For context, according to 2024 data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, 20.4% of businesses fail in their first year after opening, 49.4% fail in the first 5 years, and 65.3% fail in their first 10 years. Compare that to 98% for clothing brands. So yes, it makes a lot of sense to advise students to join a big fashion conglomerate as opposed to starting their own independent fashion brand, but that is never where our most idealistic notions lead us.
So a return to as small is beautiful philosophy, I guess, where you are more interested maybe in working with the community. You still got to make a living.
Yeah.
But you hope to work with the communities, and you hope to work maybe more local, and your ambition isn't necessarily to go to Paris and land that big job with an LVMH brand.
In this world, though, resisting the impulse to grow your business is not just an ethical idea about resisting overproduction. It can also be, again, a good marketing tool, keeping your product exclusive and inaccessible and in demand. Roger also thinks it's just a good business idea.
So I think the mindset shift is more to just looking at how can I become stable. I achieve stability. Stability is more important than growth, because growth can kill you, because you then have to find more budget to finance your production.
Growth can kill you, or it can dilute the promise of your product. This happens all the time, right? Brands start out high quality, then they move to cheaper production and hope that their business survives off of their initial reputation. One of the brands that arguably used to be part of this artisanal niche, Too Good, just recently announced that their 2026 spring-summer collection would be their last. The Substack Big Pants Waste Fabric, which is written by Jake Silbert, High Snobiety's director of news, did a very interesting deep dive, which I will link down below and sort of quickly go over right now, because I think it is a great case study of how it can go for these brands when they decide to move production to different facilities to try to make more money or bring their costs down or what have you. So he says the pieces started off slow-made extreme quality, where you could find the initials of everyone who worked on them printed onto the labels. They had French seams, everything was locally sourced, organically dyed fabrics, classic oversized silhouettes. When they were selling clothes, the brand's website read, "For too long, we have witnessed the honest clothing of working people being stolen and arrogated in the name of so-called utility wear and industrial chic. We shall sweep aside the crumbling detritus of plutocrat designers and clear the way for a new aesthetic rooted in individuality and honesty. A liberating mode that is available to all, male and female, old and young. We celebrate the craft and the toil of the workers, not faceless serfs running up disposable fads in far-flung sweatshops, but named artisans with pride in their labor." Okay, so I think a lot of brands have this same sort of messaging. I don't know if they say it with quite the same amount of pretension, but the facts are largely the same. Too Good sold $2,000 coats and $900 trousers. Then, of course, comes the fall. Silbert reports that Too Good's quality started to degrade in in late 2019 while prices remained the same. It became clear that even though they sourced the materials locally, they had moved production to a facility in Portugal. In a 2020 British Vogue article, the sisters maintained that the quality was the same, but Silbert disagrees, and he was not happy with some of the pants he bought in 2020. So how does this happen? Silbert seems to agree with Rogers' outlook on the dangers of a growth mindset. He wrote, "I think that Too Good was cynically ambitious, too quick to abandon the small batch formula that made it so essential in a rush for growth. The same dearth of self-awareness that allowed its designers to claim allegiance with the honest clothing of working people by selling four-figure jackets eventually allowed them to abandon those same principles. Instead of celebrating the craft and the toil of the workers, Too Good became just another clothing brand." I'm sure part of it is that the sisters were exhausted. They realized how much work and money it takes to produce clothing in this small batch artisanal way. And like Alejandra, they think everyone uses factories, why not us? Again, to be sure, there are factories that make beautiful, high-quality clothing. You just have to find them and do quality assurance and pick the right one. So the beautiful dream has some financial realities. These brands need to make clothing, hopefully without giving up their quality or ethics. They recognize that their products are completely outside of most people's budgets, and yet want as many people as possible to wear them, or so they say. Running a business like this is extremely hard work, I recognize that, and the siren song of outsourcing production and higher profits must be ever present. Of course, we can argue for a change in shopping habits. Everyone needs to buy less, buy it more intentionally, and spend more money on each individual piece.
You know, the significance of like investing in a $1,300 jacket or something, which, you know, there's something to say for that, you know, because you really have to, if you don't have like endless resources, it really demands something from you to decide, I'm going to buy this jacket. The people that I engage with or that I talk to, you know, sometimes they can have, you know, they think about buying a piece for a couple of weeks and they look up new photos or they ask people, did you see it in real life? How was the touch or how was the hand feel? So it's really, you know, a long-term process before you buy. But I also really feel quite strongly that, you know, taken as a whole, you know, this new wave of menswear brands, I really do feel that there is somewhat of a problem lingering underneath when it comes to the prices.
It's a classic pick two situation, but we want all three: high quality, affordable, and sustainable. So how do we make that happen?
So I had a conversation recently with Carter Altman from Carter Young, this US brand, and he's now based in London. And what I found really refreshing about what he said was that he said, I don't want to make clothing that only a few people can afford or few people can actually buy and wear. He tries to work with good fabrics, with good craftspeople, but he also takes into consideration, like, how can I make my clothing approachable? How can I make it affordable? And you have to make compromises then. So his suiting, for example, is made in China. But, Chinese manufacturers can also be pretty good.
A lot of these brands are already operating outside of the main fashion system, so they could try even more out-of-the-box ideas to bring costs down.
Maybe we can do something collectively. Let's say, you know, if 15 or 20 brands together invest in, you know, a factory, for example, and then decide, let's make, you know, our clothes in that factory that we now co-own. You know, it's just an out there example.
Businesses like Carter Young have both made to measure and ready to wear. This brand called Garuda has one jacket that's made two different ways with vastly different price points. I suspect this strategy is one where you use your higher paying customers to subsidize your lower paying ones. When I worked in podcasting, we actually did something similar. We would have, you know, big budget clients that would pay a good amount of money for something that even could be relatively simple, like an interview show. And then you would use that to subsidize smaller independent passion projects. And that works fairly well for small production companies. But of course, as you know, just because someone works in a small company doesn't mean that there are no issues, no controversies.
You know, even if it's a workshop of 12 people, like, is there a trade union? Are the people working there, have they had to sign a non-disclosure agreement? Or are they free to talk about what's actually going on in their workplace? So I think even with small workplaces, there can still be like very serious problems and very serious labor rights issues.
No, nothing is perfect, but we have to keep trying to move towards an alternative way of manufacturing clothing because we cannot continue relying on the sweatshop model to keep prices low.
You know, that said, like I do think like a healthier model for the fashion industry is definitely a slower, more localized industry where the people who are making the clothes are the ones who receive the profits of their labor, and where there aren't these big brands acting as interlopers between the people who want to buy the clothes and the people who make the clothes.
If you haven't guessed it by now, this is Tansy Hoskins. She wrote the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion. She investigates supply chains and the fashion industry.
The problem is obviously that the fashion industry is completely controlled by a very small number of corporations who have like built the model and benefit from the model and are doing everything they can to make it seem like that's normal, you know, and that we all benefit from it and we should all just keep it in place. Anything that moves us like away from that model is a good thing, but we must, you know, ultimately like deal with that side of the fashion industry, I think, not kind of like retreat into small bubbles when the rest of the industry will still be there being so, you know, so exploitative and so toxic.
Not to pour a bucket of cold water on the situation, but Tansy is not here to pussyfoot around. She is not overly concerned with the independent choices of a couple of small actors because the biggest players rule the school.
Because there's currently no major brand in the world that pays a living wage throughout its supply chain. And it's like terrible.
I did wait until the end of the video to really drill down on how horrible the status quo is because I know people are sick of hearing it and it's a downer, but it is true and we need to be reminded of it.
Corporate power, you know, the power imbalance is so great between like workers at the bottom and then like literal like billionaires, you know, some of the richest people in the world. I saw in the news today that the owner of Zara is getting over a $3 billion dividend from his company, you know, and then at the other end you have like women being paid £90 a month. So it's a mess. It's a real mess.
Thankfully, it is not all doom and gloom. There are some solutions to this, and it is not to start 100 more small artisanal brands. Since the power lies with fashion's biggest players, they also have the opportunity to impact the biggest change.
The brands could just reduce the amount of profit that they make and like literally like double the wages of the women in the factories or triple the wages of the women in the factories. But they won't do this because, you know, the shareholders want to buy another super yacht.
Garment workers are typically women. Of course, I followed up with the most obvious question, which is how much would paying the garment workers a fair wage increase the cost of clothing?
Yeah, so every study that's done into this shows that if you wanted to double like the amount of the garment price that goes to a worker, you know, it would put the price of the garment up by like 12 pence or so. Like it totally is possible. They would still be making millions and billions, but yeah, that's not how the model works.
Ultimately, we come down to the question about individual choices for creators and consumers. Not that these artisanal brands were necessarily founded with the goal to revolutionize the fashion industry, but they are also obviously not the panacea we need.
I think it's no coincidence that we've been driven into this dead end by neoliberalism of thinking that the way that we change the fashion industry is by changing the way we shop, because that's so convenient for the brands, and because it doesn't help anybody, it doesn't do anything. It means that you just keep shopping, and you know it means that we all walk around feeling like miserable and guilty as well.
It's the no ethical consumption under capitalism question. I personally think my personal decisions matter, and I would never discount the effect that public pressure has on demanding change from the fashion industry. But I am also a person that believes in systems. I don't think it's super useful to shame billionaires for being greedy. I blame the system that allows them to do it. And I would focus on changing the system because I just don't think you're going to be able to berate billionaires into being better people.
You know, I really believe like fashion can't be fixed within a vacuum. Like I do believe that we need, you know, massive social change the major way that we could make clothing sustainable is by redistributing wealth across society, so that ultimately everybody could afford to buy, you know, the beautiful, like, bespoke organic item that they wanted to have, and they wouldn't be driven into like these, like, you know, fast fashion websites and shops, because that is ultimately all they can afford.
The funniest thing about this is that fashion is still at its base an identifier. This niche appeals to you and me because we are unique. We're not like everyone else, and we don't want to be.
And I think that's why I was personally interested in this, because I found myself more and more interested in artisan brands, like, on a personal level of what I want to buy. You know, like, I was thinking, like, why do I actually want to buy? I was looking for something that nobody else knew about, because we all want to mark ourselves out with our clothes. We all want to be individuals in some way. You know, you want to say you want to communicate something. So I think what I was looking for is, how can I communicate? How can I communicate that I'm special? I think that's what we're all asking in some way. Maybe we're not. My grandma would, like, I always remember her being like, why would you want to, like, stand out, or why would you want to look different? But I think I always want to, I think for me it's about standing out in the right way, or like communicating that I'm an individual in a way that is also, you know, so that I'm not crazy. It's like the balance of that.
So that is it. Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Funnily enough, during the time it took for me to make this video, there has been a little bit of online backlash against Evan Kenori, specifically on the Throwing Fits subreddit, which, again, I think I might make my own video about that specifically, because the menswear communities, there's a lot of them, and they're all very interesting to me. But yeah, I just think that people are thinking and talking about all these inherent tensions that we've discussed around accessibility and sustainability and fair wages and inaccessibility and pricing and luxury, and, you know, these things are important, but at the same time they're inaccessible, and, you know, what does it all mean? So I do, if you're interested in this, you know, be careful of that subreddit. It can be a little scary, but there's some interesting stuff on there, and I think there will probably be more discussions about it before this video comes out. So I'm excited to hear about what you guys think, and thank you again.